The origins of the Philistines according to the Bible. The Philistines were known for their fierce and warlike nature, living in the land to the southwest of Israel, bordered by the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. The term Philistine originates from the Hebrew word Philistia. When translated into Greek as Palestini, it evolved into the contemporary term Palestine. The Philistines are first recorded in Scripture in the Table of Nations, a list of the patriarchal founders of 70 nations descended from Noah, Genesis 10 verse 14, and Pathrusim and Casluhim, from whom came the Philistines, and Caphtorim. It's believed that the Philistines came from Caphtor, which is the Hebrew term for the island of Crete in the surrounding Aegean area. Amos 9 verse 7. Are you, degenerate ones, not as the despised sons of Ethiopia to me, O sons of Israel, says the Lord? Have I not brought up Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans Syrians from Kir? The Philistines were people who came from Noah's youngest son, Ham. They lived in the area near the Aegean Sea. Genesis 9 verses 18 to 19. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. Ham would become the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and from these men the whole earth was populated and scattered with inhabitants. For reasons not explained, they moved from their original location to the area near the Mediterranean coast, close to Gaza. Their history of traveling by sea links the Philistines with the Sea Peoples. The Bible mentions that the Philistines interacted with Abraham and Isaac around 2000 BC. Genesis 21 verse 32, Amplified Bible. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, got up and returned to the land of the Philistines. After Isaac's experiences with the Philistines as recorded in Genesis 26 verse 18, they are mentioned again briefly in the book of Exodus, right after the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. Exodus 13 verse 17, Amplified Bible. So it happened when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was nearer. For God said, the people might change their minds when they see war, that is, that there will be war, and return to Egypt. The road to the Philistine country mentioned refers to a famous ancient pathway known as Via Maris, which translates to the Way of the Sea. This important route was one of the three primary trade roads in ancient Israel, stretching from the Nile Delta through Canaan and Syria, reaching even into the Mesopotamia area in Southwest Asia. According to the Old Testament, around the 13th century BC, which is the time of Samuel and Samson, the Philistines expanded from the coastal regions of Canaan into the interior. They established their communities prominently in 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, as mentioned in Joshua 13 verse 3. Joshua 13 verse 3, Amplified Bible. From Shihor, waterway, which is east of Egypt at the southern end of Canaan, northward to the border of Ekron, all of it regarded as Canaanite. The 5 rulers of the Philistines, the Gazite, Ashodite, the Ashkelonite, the Gittite, the Ekronite, and the Avite. These cities each had their own king or lord, which comes from the Hebrew word seren, sometimes also translated as tyrant. It seems these kings worked together as a team, but still each one looked after his own city. Right from the start, the Philistines were sometimes friends and sometimes fierce enemies of the people who followed God. The Philistines moved from the south of Europe or Greece over to the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, that area includes countries like Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria. The Philistines were ahead of their time because they used iron for their weapons and tools, which was better than the bronze the Israelites had. Even when Saul was king, around 1050 to 1010 BC, the Israelites needed the Philistines' help to make their iron tools sharp or fix them. 1 Samuel 13 verses 19 to 21, Amplified Bible. Now no blacksmith, metal worker, could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, "Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears." So all the men of Israel went down to the Philistines, each to get his plowshare, pickaxe, or sickle sharpened. The Philistines, with their superior weapons and aggressive approach to war, were a constant problem for Israel, stopping them from growing as a nation. For about 200 years, the Philistines made life hard for the Israelites, often attacking their land. The Israelites couldn't overcome the Philistines' strong army until Samuel and later David, with God's help, managed to beat them. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and he named it Ebenezer, Stone of Help, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." So the Philistines were subdued, and they did not come any more into Israelite territory. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered the city's territory from the Philistines. Also, there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. 1 Samuel 7 verses 12 to 14, Amplified Bible. The Philistines, who had better weapons and a strong army, kept causing trouble for Israel for almost 200 years. They would often attack and make life hard for the Israelites. The people of Israel couldn't stand up to the Philistines' powerful army. But this all stopped when Samuel, and later David, with God's help, managed to beat the Philistines. 2 Samuel 5 verses 22 to 25, Amplified Bible. The Philistines came up once again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. When David inquired of the Lord, he said, "You shall not go up, but circle around behind them, and come at them in front of the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then you shall pay attention and act promptly. For at that time the Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines." David did just as the Lord had commanded him, and struck down the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer. In the Old Testament, we learn that the Philistines worshipped three main gods: Ashtoreth, Dagon, and Baalzebub. They had special places to worship these gods in different cities. When the Philistines went to war, they even took small figures of their gods with them, thinking this would help them win. They were also very afraid of the power of Israel's Ark of the Covenant, recognizing it had done amazing things. They took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon, and set it beside the image of Dagon, their chief idol. 1 Samuel 5 verse 2. When the people of Ashdod got up early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. 1 Samuel 5 verse 3. The Philistines were well known for making and drinking a lot of alcohol, especially beer. When people find old Philistine cities, they often discover many places where beer and wine were made, along with lots of beer cups and other items used for drinking. The Israelites often referred to the Philistines as uncircumcised, which meant they had no relationship with God at that time. 1 Samuel 14 verse 6, Amplified Bible. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let us cross to the garrison of these uncircumcised men. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is nothing to prevent the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Nowadays, the term Philistine is often used to describe someone who is unsophisticated or lacking in culture. However, this is not an accurate portrayal of the Philistines of history. The Philistines were actually a highly advanced seafaring people who, for many generations, were more advanced than Israel. The Philistines and Moses. The ancient Philistines had already established themselves in the land of Canaan before the arrival of Moses and the Israelites, who claimed it as their promised land bestowed by God. Due to the differences in religion and culture and the struggle for control of Canaan, there were several conflicts between the Israelites and the Philistines. In the Old Testament, the Philistines were considered as enemies of Israel, as they were constantly at odds with them since their very first encounters. When Moses sent 12 Hebrew scouts to explore Canaan, they were intimidated by the powerful Philistines. To avoid early conflicts, Moses chose to lead the Israelites around the regions where the Philistines lived. In the Exodus from Egypt, God promised the Israelites that Canaan would be their home. Exodus 23, verses 27 to 28. I will send my terror ahead of you, and I will throw into confusion all the people among whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you in flight. I will send hornets ahead of you, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite before you. I will establish your borders from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, the Mediterranean, and from the wilderness to the river Euphrates, for I will hand over the residents of the land to you, and you shall drive them out before you. Exodus 23, verse 31. Moses sent 12 scouts to survey Canaan before the Hebrews settled the land. After 40 days, the scouts returned with a report that terrified the Israelites. They reported to Moses and said, "We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. But the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified, walled, and very large. Moreover, we saw there the descendants of Anak, people of great stature and courage. The people descended from Amalek live in the land of the Negev, south country. The Hittite, the Jebusite, and the Amorite live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the Dead Sea and along the side of the Jordan." Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and take possession of it, for we will certainly conquer it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people of Canaan, for they are too strong for us." Numbers 13, verses 27 to 31. Anak was a man who belonged to a lineage of giants mentioned in Joshua 15, verse 13. When the Israelites heard the report of the spies about Canaan, they hesitated to enter, and as a consequence of their unwillingness to act further on God's promise, they were destined to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. When the Israelites did finally settle in the Promised Land, they warred during the time of the Old Testament books of Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Kings, and 2 Chronicles. Israel engaged in conflicts with the Philistines in an attempt to displace them from the Promised Land, from Abraham to King Hezekiah. According to the Bible, the Israelites believed that God had promised to protect them from destruction and grant them victory in battle, allowing them to conquer large territories in the Promised Land. Joshua 13, verse 21. Joshua 21, verse 43, Amplified Bible. So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, ancestors, and they took possession of it and lived in it. Israel engaged in several battles against the Philistines, but not all of them were successful. The outcomes of 7 major battles between Israel and the Philistines highlight this fact. During the Battle of Aphek, approximately 34,000 Israeli soldiers lost their lives. Hebrew elders questioned why God allowed them to suffer so many casualties. The Philistine army soldiers were afraid of the Israelis' Ark of the Covenant, but they managed to capture it during the battle. 1 Samuel 4. Saul. The Battle of Ebenezer, in which Israel is victorious. 1 Samuel 7, verses 1 and 13 to 14. The Battle of Michmash, in which Saul almost lost his son Jonathan, who successfully fought against the Philistine army. 1 Samuel 14, verses 31 to 46. The Battle of Mount Gilboa is a significant event in the Hebrew Bible. It marks the end of King Saul's reign as he falls on his sword and dies, following the deaths of his 3 sons at the hands of the Philistine army. 1 Samuel 31 verses 1-6, Amplified Bible. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before them and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and they killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised Philistines will come and pierce me through, and abuse and mock me." But his armor-bearer would not, because he was terrified of doing such a thing. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men died together on that day. Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, worshipped false gods. As a result, he faced misfortune and failed to win the Battle of Shephelah. On the other hand, King Hezekiah of Judah was obedient to God and successfully defeated the Philistines. 2 Kings 18 verses 5-8, Amplified Bible. Hezekiah trusted in and relied confidently on the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was no one like him among the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him, for he clung to the Lord. He did not turn away from faithfully following him, but he kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. And the Lord was with Hezekiah. He was successful wherever he went, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria and refused to serve him. He defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza, the most distant city, and its borders, from the isolated lookout tower to the populous fortified city. Having an enemy in the Philistines did unite Israel under its first kings, as is written about King Saul in 1 Samuel 14 verse 52. All the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. Samson and David had individual encounters with the Philistine enemies, and their stories are dramatically recorded in the Bible. David. Achish, king of Gath, worked with David in times of national emergency, but later dealt with him. How did David attack a Philistine giant? The story of David defeating Goliath in the Old Testament has become a legend of the little guy overcoming a formidable enemy. Before their brief duel, the armies of the Israelites and Philistines are gathered on opposite hills, overlooking a valley. Goliath initiates the battle. Then a champion came out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor overlapping metal plates which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had bronze shin protectors on his legs and a bronze javelin hung between his shoulders. The wooden shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. The blade head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and a shield bearer walked in front of him. 1 Samuel 17 verses 4-7. Goliath challenges any man in the Israeli army to fight him. If the Israelite defeats Goliath, he says, the Philistines will become Israeli subjects. No man in the Israeli army responds to the challenge. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. 1 Samuel 17 verse 11. David left his flock of sheep to visit his 3 older brothers at their army encampment. On his visit, he heard Goliath's challenge, which was being repeated for the 40th day, and learned that whoever defeated Goliath would receive Saul's daughter's hand in marriage and tax breaks for the family of the slayer. David had faith in the God of Abraham, and he was confident when he responded to Goliath's challenge. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? 1 Samuel 17 verse 26. Despite King Saul's initial hesitation about David, a young boy fighting the formidable Goliath, David remains confident in his ability to defeat him. David had previously killed lions and bears that threatened his sheep, so he sees this Philistine as nothing more than a vicious wild animal that he can overcome with God's help. David assures Saul that he is capable of defeating Goliath. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." 1 Samuel 17 verse 37. David says to Goliath, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." 1 Samuel 17 verse 45. David defeats Goliath with one shot. The Philistine army flees and is pursued by Israelites, who kill many. After defeating Goliath, David took Goliath's sword and cut off his head. He then brought the head to Jerusalem, which was not yet Israel's capital city. When King Saul asked David who he was, David revealed that he was the son of Jesse. Samuel had prophesied that Jesse's son would rule as the king of Israel after Saul. Samson. Samson was born a Nazirite and was chosen by God to fulfill his work in Israel, and he was given extraordinary strength to do it. The book of Judges contains the story of his life. Again, the Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines 40 years. Judges 13 verse 1. At this point, the author introduces us to a man named Manoah, whose wife was unable to conceive. In the Bible, there are several instances where the angel of the Lord appeared to women and promised them a miraculous son who would become a deliverer. This is seen in the birth of Isaac in the Old Testament and John the Baptist in the New Testament. One such promised son was to be born to Manoah's wife, who would grow up to save Israel from the Philistines. However, unlike other judges, the angel instructed that the child be raised according to the Nazirite vow. This meant he couldn't drink wine or beer, and he couldn't trim his hair. It is interesting to note that the angel advised a pregnant woman not to consume wine or beer or eat anything unclean. This would consecrate her son to God as a Nazirite, even while he was still in the womb. Although the angel spoke directly to the woman, she went to her husband and shared what had happened. Manoah prayed that the angel would return after hearing the news. God confirmed that the woman's report was accurate, and the angel reappeared to confirm everything he had said. Manoah's wife named her child Samson. God blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him, readying Samson for the work prepared for him. Samson, who had been dedicated to God's service since birth, made some questionable life decisions. However, his life ultimately proved that God can use even those who are flawed. Once, while in Timnah, Samson met a young Philistine woman and expressed his desire to marry her to his parents. Although his parents tried to offer him wisdom by cautioning him against marrying someone who wasn't a part of God's people, they were unaware that Samson's interest in the woman was from the Lord. God wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for a confrontation. Samson was attacked by a young lion on his journey to Timnah, where his bride-to-be lived, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him fiercely, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands. This was a strong indication that he had been chosen and enabled by God for a supernatural mission. Samson chose to pose a riddle to the Philistines at a feast that was most likely supposed to function as his engagement party. The prize for answering the riddle within a week would be 30 changes of clothes. In biblical days, an additional set of clothing was a sign of honor and dignity. The Philistines grew enraged when they couldn't figure out what it meant. The men threatened to kill Samson's bride, who was also one of their own, and her family, unless she got Samson to reveal her the answer and share it with them. After 7 days of crying, she begged Samson to reveal the answer to the Philistines' riddle. Samson, fed up with her nagging, finally told her. When the Philistine men gave the correct answer, Samson realized that his wife had told them. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson, and he killed 30 Philistine men in another town, taking their clothes to fulfill his end of the deal. He returned home, but without his wife. After some time, Samson brought about further destruction on the Philistines. He wanted to visit his wife, but her father would not let him enter her room. He had given her to another man because he assumed Samson was not happy with her. He destroyed their crops by catching 300 foxes, tying their tails together with a rope and torches, setting them on fire, and releasing them into the fields. The Philistines retaliated by slaying Samson's wife and father, and Samson, in turn, avenged the murders with his bare hands. In the village of Judah, the Philistines launched a siege as a way to seek retribution against Samson. Meanwhile, Samson was hiding in a cave. To appease the Philistines, 3,000 men from Judah were sent to arrest Samson, under the pretext that his actions had brought trouble upon them by riling up the Philistine oppressors. It's ironic that the very man sent by God to rescue them from the Philistines was being delivered to the Philistines. Samson agreed to go with them only after they promised not to kill him themselves. At that exact moment, the Spirit of the Lord descended upon Samson with great strength. This was terrible news for the Philistines, as having the Spirit of the Lord fall heavily upon someone you're fighting against is not a desirable situation. Samson's foes were outnumbered because he was empowered by God's Spirit. Given his strength, the ropes used to bind him were insignificant. He found a fresh donkey jawbone and used it to slaughter 1,000 men. He was able to accomplish what would have been impossible without the Lord's help. After finishing his judgment on the Philistines, Samson got extremely thirsty and cried out to the Lord. The Lord graciously replied by restoring his vigor by creating a spring there. It was dubbed Spring of the One Who Cried Out by Samson, and he judged Israel 20 years. When the Lord's Spirit descended on Samson, he was accompanied by miraculous activity. In the Old Testament, the Lord's Spirit descended on people in response to specific circumstances. Since the time of the New Testament, however, the Lord's Spirit has come to dwell in every believer. However, Samson's greatest hit to the Philistines occurred when he met Delilah. It is not clear whether Delilah was a Philistine woman, but her loyalties lie with them and their silver. The Philistine leaders asked her to persuade Samson to confide in her about where his great strength came from, so that they could overpower him, tie him up, and make him helpless. They promised her a great deal of money for her aid. 3 times Delilah tried to learn his secret, while the Philistines lay waiting to ambush him. Each time Samson gave her a false story about the source of his strength, but she steadily wore him down. In the end, Delilah used the very trick Samson's bride had once employed when she betrayed him to the Philistines. She pleaded, "How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me?" Delilah accused Samson of making fun of her and wouldn't have betrayed him if she truly loved him. However, she finally got the truth out of him after nagging him constantly. Samson was worn out and revealed that if his hair was cut, he would lose his strength and become like any other man. While Samson was asleep on her lap, Delilah shaved his head. The Philistine leaders were hiding and had brought silver, so Delilah was free to count her money while the deed was done. The Philistine leaders assembled to give a huge sacrifice to their god Dagon, while Samson crushed grain in the prison. They were all set to rejoice that their deity had delivered their foe to them. During a gathering of the Philistines, they were in high spirits and asked Samson to entertain them. They positioned him between the pillars of the temple, which was packed with about 3,000 people on the roof. Samson realized that this was an opportunity to defeat the Philistines once and for all. He prayed to God for strength, and with all his might, pushed the pillars, causing the temple to collapse and crushing the Philistine leaders and the entire populace. The last sentence Samson gave was about the Philistines. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, Remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Thus, Samson killed more of Israel's oppressors that day than he had killed all the rest of his days. Who did the Philistines worship? The ongoing conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines was partially due to their religious differences. The Israelites worshipped only one god, while the Philistines worshipped Baal, who was considered to be a universal god of fertility. Baal was particularly important to the agrarian culture of the Philistines and was known as the Lord of Rain and Dew, as well as the Lord of Earth. The Philistines also worshipped Astarte, the Queen of Heaven, who was the goddess of war and sexual love. The Canaanites used to burn offerings and pour libations in her honor. Another significant deity to the Philistines was Dagon, the god of crop fertility, whose name means grain. Dagon was credited as the legendary inventor of the plow. When the Israelites were influenced by the beliefs of their neighboring Canaanite tribesmen and worshipped false gods, God became very angry with his Hebrew people. Worshipping gods other than the God of Israel was the main complaint God had against his people in the Old Testament. What happened to the Canaanites? After the Israelites took control of Canaan in the late 2nd millennium, their conquest of the land was a prolonged and complicated process, as described in the historical books of the Old Testament. As the Israelite civilization expanded across Canaan, scholars of the Old Testament believed that the Hebrews and the earliest Philistine Canaanites blended their cultures and DNA with other inhabitants of the region. Their final fate. The Philistine people assimilated into the Persian Empire after defeats by the ancient superpowers of Assyria and Babylon. As a result, they lost their identity as a separate culture